about the first day of June 2017, I started eating a hypercarnivore diet, which means I was getting at least 70% of my calories from animal products, primarily eggs, dairy products, and the flesh of steers, also known as beef. Here's an example of what I was eating in June of 2017. On June 20th, 2017, I ate 7 large eggs, 2 slices of bacon, 75 grams of beef sirloin, 4 ounces of heavy cream, 2 tablespoons of bacon fat, 8 ounces of 80% lean ground beef, a half cup of sour cream, a teaspoon of fish oil, a cup of bone broth, and 2 ProThera multimineral tablets. That provided 2,250 calories, 141 grams of protein, 179 grams of fat, and only 15 grams of carbohydrate. All of that carbohydrate coming from sour cream, eggs, cream, bone broth, and bacon. Before attempting the hypercarnivore diet in November 2016, after about 5 years on a diet free of animal products, a whole foods plant-based diet, my total cholesterol was 154 milligrams per deciliter, my LDL cholesterol was 78, my HDL was 60 milligrams per deciliter, triglycerides were 78 milligrams per deciliter, and fasting glucose was 88 milligrams per deciliter. All of this was stellar. For some reason, my globulin and phosphorus were both a little bit below normal range at that time. Within a month of adopting the hypercarnivore diet, my total LDL and HDL cholesterol reached 419 milligrams per deciliter, 293, and 110 respectively. Yes, you heard that correctly. My total cholesterol was 419 milligrams per deciliter, and my LDL was 293 milligrams per deciliter. Put otherwise, compared to my lipid levels in 2016, when I was still avoiding animal products, after being on a hypercarnivore diet for less than a month, my total cholesterol was more than doubled, and my LDL cholesterol was 3.75 times higher. Notably, although my globulin level rose into the normal range, now my albumin level was above the normal range, and my phosphorus rose by 0.2 milligrams, still below the normal range. Many friends who saw this report warned me to stop the hypercarnivore diet. Nevertheless, despite getting good advice from good people trying to be helpful, I continued the dumb diet, and in September 2018, my total LDL and HDL cholesterol were 352, 239, and 102 respectively. My phosphorus level remains slightly below the normal range, and now my fasting glucose was 103 milligrams per deciliter, indicating that after 15 months on the very high saturated fat diet, I was becoming a type 2 diabetic. This increase in my fasting glucose occurred despite the fact that on the hypercarnivore regime, I significantly reduced my body fat to the point that my waist circumference was under 31 inches at a height of about 69 inches. I ignored the elevated cholesterol and fasting glucose, rationalizing that it was no issue because I was getting so lean on the outside. So I didn't stop. I was possessed and I didn't know it. In addition to these lab findings, from the start of the hypercarnivore diet, I experienced muscle cramps, a common issue for people on diets low in plant foods, due to increased urinary mineral losses and dietary potassium deficiency. On the advice of advocates of low carbohydrate diets, I took extra salt and supplemented potassium to counter the mineral depleting effects of the low carbohydrate, high protein diet. However, as a consequence of increasing my salt intake, I started retaining water and developed an issue with lower limb edema. Eventually, during 2019, I acknowledged that the very low carbohydrate hypercarnivore diet was simply potassium deficient, as indicated by my need to take potassium supplements to prevent cramping. And since a high salt intake both failed to control the severe muscle cramps and caused water retention, I reduced my salt and fat intake and resumed eating high potassium fruits and reduced red meat, eggs, and whole milk intake in favor of more poultry and especially 2% milk, which supplies more sugar, magnesium, and potassium than meat. This led me to call my way of eating meats and sweets. In my carnist delusion, I thought I was really onto something. In 2020, both of my parents died. My mother died under intensive care after enduring coronary artery bypass operation. The operation was deemed successful, but my 85-year-old mother died of post-operative septicemia and kidney failure 10 days later in intensive care. No one but my father could visit her during the ordeal due to the 2020 pandemic rules. 6 months later, my 87-year-old father died with prostate cancer. His last 6 months were miserable. As a consequence of his conventional prostate cancer treatments, he had a urinary catheter and urinary difficulties that led to repeated infections and bouts with edema and kidney failure. Watching my parents die with these diseases woke me up. I realized that I had resumed eating an animal-based diet, partially or to a great extent in order to avoid conflict with them. But they died from or with a set of diseases linked to animal-based eating. On the hypercarnivore diet, I was putting myself at risk for the very same diseases. The natural LDL cholesterol range is between 50 and 70 milligrams per deciliter, as found in healthy human newborns, native human populations, free-living primates, and other wild animals. None of these populations develop atherosclerosis. Randomized controlled trials have shown that atherosclerosis progression and ischemic heart disease events are minimized when LDL cholesterol is below 70 milligrams per deciliter. And there are no major safety concerns in any trials that lowered LDL cholesterol to the range of 50 to 70 milligrams per deciliter. This study found that even in people having so-called normal LDL levels defined as less than 160 milligrams per deciliter, LDL cholesterol was independently associated with both the presence and the extent of atherosclerosis. Further, this study also found that LDL cholesterol levels predict the presence and extent of atherosclerosis even in individuals who had none of the other conventional risk factors such as smoking, blood pressure above 120/80, fasting glucose below 100, total cholesterol above 200, or HDL below 40 milligrams per deciliter. In other words, the greater the LDL cholesterol, the more atherosclerosis, regardless of other risk factors. Seventh-day Adventist vegan vegetarians have average LDL cholesterol levels of 1.8 millimoles per liter, which is 69.6 milligrams per deciliter, putting their levels in the natural range of 50 to 70 milligrams per deciliter, the range associated with the absence of progression of atherosclerosis and minimal risk of coronary heart disease. This 2007 study compared lipid levels of meat eaters, lacto-ovo-vegetarians, lacto-vegetarians, and vegans. Only the vegans had average LDL cholesterol below 70 milligrams per deciliter at 69, compared to 88 for lacto-vegetarians, 101 for lacto-ovo-vegetarians, and 123 for meat eaters. Thus, this study found that the more animal products consumed, the greater the LDL cholesterol level. This has been my experience as well. As shown earlier, on the hypercarnivore diet, my LDL cholesterol was ranging between 230 and 300, or more than 3 to 4 times the natural level that prevents atherosclerosis and coronary artery disease events. In contrast, in 2016, after eating a whole foods plant-based diet for 5 years, my LDL was 78, very close to the optimal range of 50 to 70 milligrams per deciliter. That was the lowest LDL cholesterol I have had since 2006 when I started getting levels tested. Using the Framingham risk calculations, the lipid levels that I had in 2018 on the hypercarnivore diet doubled my 10-year risk of incident heart disease compared with the lipid levels that I had in 2016 on the vegan diet. Many people do not know that elevated cholesterol is also a risk factor for prostate cancer and other cancers. Tumors need cholesterol to grow, and we have evidence that elevated serum cholesterol levels promote the growth of many types of cancer, particularly prostate cancer. Human and animal studies, as well as cell biology models, suggest that high circulating cholesterol levels increases risk of aggressive prostate cancer. The authors of this study reported that lipid levels of prostate cancer patients are significantly higher than those of non-cancer patients. They also performed a rodent study that confirmed that cholesterol and saturated fatty acids synergistically promote the progression of prostate cancer. These authors reported that prostate cancer proliferation is influenced by LDL cholesterol availability. Restricting LDL availability led to a reduction of cell growth, and supplementing LDL promoted the cancer proliferation. These data indicate that when I was eating a hypercarnivore diet, I was increasing my risk of suffering my father's fate. Whereas elevated serum cholesterol promotes prostate cancer, a whole foods plant-based diet, including soy products, may inhibit prostate cancer growth. This study, published in Nutrition and Cancer, compared the immune functions of male vegetarians to the same number of age and sex-matched meat-eating controls. The authors reported that the cytotoxic activity of the natural killer cells of the vegetarians was double that found in the meat eaters. They concluded that this enhanced natural cytotoxicity may be one of the factors contributing to the reduced cancer risk found in vegetarian populations. In this study, men with prostate cancer were assigned to either a control group or a group prescribed a soy-rich vegan diet along with some supplements, aerobic exercises, and a set of yoga practices. Those men who were prescribed the vegan diet had a 4% reduction of prostate-specific antigen, whereas those in the control group had a 6% increase. Further, similar to the previous study, this study found that serum from men who most closely adhered to the whole foods plant-based diet inhibited prostate cancer cell growth by 70%, compared to only 9% for the serum of men in the control group. There were no changes in testosterone in the intervention group. This study randomly assigned 58 men at high risk of prostate cancer to consume one of 3 protein isolates containing 40 grams of protein every day. Group 1 received soy protein isolate rich in isoflavones. Group 2 received soy protein isolate with little isoflavone content. And Group 3 received cow milk protein. During the 6-month intervention, prostate cancer incidence was more than 6 times higher for the group consuming milk protein isolate compared to those consuming soy protein. Prostate cancer typically occurs in men later in life, long after testosterone levels have peaked. During this time, the ratio of circulating estrogens to androgens may increase by up to 40%. In other words, men become estrogen dominant. Increased estrogens are known to suppress testosterone production and compete with androgens for the androgen receptor. It has also been hypothesized that rising estrogen concentrations may promote mutations and proliferation of cells. There is some evidence suggesting that among 4 types of estrogens, 1 type is benign, 1 type is actually anti-carcinogenic, and the last 2 types of estrogens, the 4 and 16 alpha-hydroxy estrogens, may be carcinogenic. In other words, like breast cancer, prostate cancer may be a consequence of toxic 16-hydroxy estrogen levels. This study showed that consumption of 40 grams of soy protein per day for 6 months increased urinary excretion of estrogens, and the ratio of 2 to 16 alpha-hydroxyestrone in men. An increased ratio of 2 to 16 hydroxyestrone has been associated with reduced breast cancer risk in women in numerous studies, and 1 study has reported a reduced risk of prostate cancer in men having an increased ratio of 2 to 16 hydroxyestrone. This study suggests that soy protein may prevent prostate cancer by reducing exposure to the genotoxic effects of estrogen metabolites. The same team reported that soy protein suppresses androgen receptor expression in the prostate without changing serum hormone levels. Recall that when testosterone levels decline with age, estrogens compete with testosterone for androgen receptors. Suppression of androgen receptor expression in the prostate of men at a high risk of prostate cancer would protect the prostate from the toxic carcinogenic effects of the 16 alpha-hydroxyestrones. This could be beneficial for prevention of prostate cancer. This systematic review and meta-analysis of observational studies found that vegetarians have a 25% reduced risk of ischemic heart disease mortality and 10% reduced risk of prostate cancer mortality. Vegans were found to have a reduced all-cause mortality risk and a 15% reduced risk of cancer incidence. Elevated cholesterol is also associated with psoriasis. Saturated fats and red meat activate the inflammatory cascades, autoimmune reactions, and gut dysbiosis that are found in psoriasis patients, while fiber and flavonoids from plants suppress inflammatory pathways. Diets with a high ratio of saturated fatty acids, low in omega-3, and high in refined carbohydrates lead to immune system malfunction and increases in inflammation as found in modern diseases including psoriasis. On the other hand, diets rich in fruits, vegetables, fiber, olive oil, and omega-3 fats, and low in animal products seem to be the safest and the most established for preventing immune malfunction and inflammation such as seen in psoriasis. This trial found that psoriasis patients had a significantly higher rate of elevated lipids compared to healthy controls. Further, treating the psoriasis patients with a statin drug reduced the severity of psoriasis. For me, compared to the extreme hypercarnivore diet, the milk, fruit, and lean white meat diet was overall superior and resulted in the most marked improvement of the psoriasis lesions in my ears, although it had little, if any, positive effect on the much larger patch of psoriasis on my scalp. Although the meats and fruits approach took care of the muscle cramping problem, it did not fully reverse the edema issue. In mid-2021, the edema problem got markedly worse. Some evenings, the swelling of my feet and ankles reminded me of my father's bouts with edema caused by a kidney malfunction in late 2020. I saw that I could be heading down the same path. At first, I tried removing salt from my diet. I was trying to solve the problem while continuing to eat meat, eggs, and dairy, all of which happen to be rich in sodium as well. Fortunately, that had only a limited impact on the edema. I continued eating a salt-free, meat-based diet into 2022 without fully resolving the problem. During the first half of 2022, I finally accepted that I needed stronger action. At this point, I naturally became interested in learning more about the relationship between diet and kidney disease. Although advocates of diets rich in animal protein claim that long-term high-protein diets do not harm kidney function, I knew that some research had reported otherwise. This study reported that red meat intake has been strongly associated with end-stage renal disease risk in a dose-dependent manner, perhaps due to the high acid load on the kidneys induced by the high content of sulfur-containing amino acids and end products from animal protein. According to the authors of this report, high dietary protein intake can cause high pressures in the kidney glomerula, which may result in kidney hyperfiltration, injury to the glomerula, and loss of protein in the urine. They also emphasize that specifically animal protein has been linked to increased risk of kidney disease. They cited one study that followed nearly 1,800 Iranians for an average of 6 years and found that people who consumed a low-carbohydrate, high-protein diet, such as I had been eating, had a 48% increased risk of chronic kidney disease diagnosis. They also noted that long-term studies may obscure the risk associated with high-protein diets because such diets might increase kidney function that's measured by filtration in the short term, resulting in damage that decreases function over the long term. These two effects would essentially cancel each other out when calculating averages of kidney function, resulting in the false impression that high-protein diets have no negative effect on kidney filtration function. Studies have also reported other harmful consequences of diets high in animal protein. Several studies have shown that high versus standard protein intakes result in elevated blood urea nitrogen, or BUN, while others have shown that urea generation is lower with protein restriction. High circulating BUN may lead to increased oxidative stress, inflammation, endothelial dysfunction, and cardiovascular diseases. Since animal foods high in protein are also high in phosphorus, high dietary animal protein intake results in high phosphorus intake. Several studies have found that high normal phosphorus levels are associated with an increased risk of cardiovascular diseases, even in people with normal kidney function. Elevated phosphorus levels have also been linked to faster progression of kidney disease. Evidently, cardiovascular and kidney disease are intimately related. In contrast to diets rich in animal protein, diets rich in plant protein have been shown to have a neutral or beneficial effect on kidney function. This literature review found that red meat, processed meat, poultry, and fish were all associated with increased risk of chronic kidney disease across multiple studies. In contrast, dietary dairy products, vegetables, legumes, nuts, and fruits have all been reported to either have no effect on risk or to reduce risk. This study of kidney responses to ingestion of animal and vegetable protein may also explain why ecological studies appear to show no negative effects from long-term high-protein diets. The subjects of this study habitually consumed about 80 grams of total protein and more than 50 grams of animal protein daily. When they were fed a single meal, providing a dose of 80 grams of animal protein as lean cooked beef, their kidneys responded with spikes in both filtration rate and renal plasma flow. More blood was going to the kidneys. In contrast, when they ate a meal providing the same 80 grams of protein, but from soy protein powder, kidney filtration rate and plasma flow barely changed over the same time period. This indicates that animal and vegetable proteins have divergent effects on kidney function. Animal protein puts more stress on the kidneys than plant protein. Further, after eating ground beef providing 80 grams of beef protein, the subjects had a 50% increase in urinary albumin loss and nearly 150% increase in urinary globulin loss, showing that the beef meal impaired kidney function. In contrast, when they ate 80 grams of soy protein, they actually had a small reduction in urinary albumin loss and only about a 25% increase in urinary globulin loss. Thus, the soy protein meal improved kidney function compared to the beef meal. In another arm of the study, subjects consumed one of 3 different diets for a period of 3 weeks each: an animal protein diet, a vegetable protein diet, and an animal protein diet with fiber supplementation in order to match the fiber to the vegetable protein diet. The vegetable protein diet contained exclusively vegetable protein, but included animal fats so that the diets were matched for polyunsaturated and saturated fat ratios. The animal protein diet provided 70% animal protein and 30% vegetable protein in order to provide adequate carbohydrate and fiber intake. The animal protein diet was lower in fiber than the vegetable protein diet, so the third diet was identical to the second, but included a fiber supplement to match the fiber content of the vegetable protein diet. All diets provided 1 gram of protein per kilogram of body weight and 35% of energy from fat. As shown in figure 2 on the right side of the slide, when the subjects ate the animal protein diet, they lost more albumin in the urine than when they were on the vegetable protein diet. Their kidneys were leaking protein. This study showed that the type of protein markedly influences the impact of protein on kidney function. Eating plant protein produces changes in kidney function comparable to those obtained by reducing the total amount of protein consumed, and prevents the increase of blood flow to the kidneys and the urinary loss of protein that is induced by animal protein. Thus, the long-term studies of high-protein diets on kidney function may be confounded by a failure to distinguish between diets high in plant protein and those high in animal protein. Briefly, in ecological studies, the negative effects of animal protein may be hidden by the positive effects of plant protein. When I read that study just reviewed that found that high animal protein meals significantly impaired kidney function in healthy subjects, leading to urinary loss of albumin, whereas plant protein actually improved kidney function, I was alarmed. I had been consuming meals providing 50 to 80 grams of animal protein. This research indicated that eating those meals day after day could have been causing my kidneys to leak albumin and globulin. Marked reductions in circulating protein levels, especially albumin, can cause edema. Consequently, I decided to put it to the test. I returned to a low animal protein vegetarian diet. Within a few months of going meat-free, while still consuming some milk products, the swelling problem was greatly improved. When I finally went dairy-free, strict vegetarian for several months, I was happy to find that I no longer frequently suffered from any alarming lower limb edema unless I seriously overindulged in salt. Although I had plenty of health-related reasons to adopt a low animal protein-based diet, I have a far more important reason to stop eating animals. I had to adopt a strictly vegetarian diet in order to stop being a hypocrite. At an early age, I realized that life is a dream that ends in death, at which point material treasures are useless, and only one's moral and spiritual status will matter. I noticed that most people around me professed moral and spiritual values, but failed to fully live in accord with those values. This had a profound impact on my life. I wanted to learn and live by the highest moral and spiritual values. I started university with a pre-med scholarship with a major in biology, but I finished with bachelor's and master's degrees in philosophy, with specializations in Buddhist and Vedic philosophy and philosophy of science. I first adopted a vegetarian diet around about the age of 20 because I wanted to live in accord with the elevated Vedic and yogic moral standard of nonviolence and non-aggression, known in Sanskrit as ahimsa. Yoga is the Vedic science of liberation and enlightenment through unifying oneself with the Supreme Being and ultimate truth. Patanjali, author of the Yoga Sutras, stated very clearly that anyone who wants freedom in this life and beyond must practice the 4 yamas, or self-restraints, those being non-harming, ahimsa, non-theft, asteya, satya, honesty, truthfulness, non-attachment, that's aparigraha, and chastity, or brahmacharya. To practice non-harming and non-theft, one must not kill innocent beings who do not pose a threat to oneself. Killing and eating someone is clearly inflicting harm upon them. Since theft is defined as taking something that is not your own from the rightful owner, and killing is taking a life that is not your own from the rightful owner, killing is also a form of theft. If I do not want to be an aggressor or a thief or a hypocrite, I have to refrain from taking life from any innocent sentient beings. David Frawley is director of the American Institute of Vedic Studies. In his book, Yoga and Ayurveda, he wrote, quote, "Meat eating is something that any student of yoga should reduce, if not avoid altogether. This is particularly true of red meat. Of course, the main reason is that meat eating violates the yogic principles of ahimsa, or nonviolence, which is the first of the yamas, or lifestyle disciplines of yoga practice. If our yoga practice is based on harming other creatures, it cannot go far." End of quote. One can't obtain relief from suffering for oneself by inflicting suffering on others, because the ultimate truth is that every being, every one of us, is but a particle of the Supreme Being, the One Self, So whatever one does to any apparent other is one is in fact doing to oneself.
Happiness. What we've seen is that great sages of the past were all vegetarians. We know that Plato was vegetarian. We know that Aristotle was vegetarian. We know that Plotinus was vegetarian. Pythagoras, the Buddha, all the rishis, etc., etc., etc. All these great beings of the past who not only themselves knew happiness, they themselves in their own life, but who are the teachers of happiness to others. These people were vegetarians. And then conversely, when you are not vegetarian, well, what does this mean? You're not going to be happy. And for the silly individual out there, well, but I'll be happy because I like the taste of bacon. Yeah, well, you're not going to be happy with cholesterol, with heart attacks, with cancer, etc., 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 and all of the diseases and illnesses that it has now been proven for over 50, 60 years occurs when an individual eats too much meat. So indeed, an individual who consumes meat ultimately is not going to be happy, either here or hereafter. Now, this last clause, of course, is important. So either here, meaning, as I was just saying, as far as their health, as far as their longevity, etc., the quality of their even material life within this world. But then, again, Lord Vishnu says, or here, or in the hereafter. What does this mean? Well, there is such a thing as karma. And when we knowingly, and now that those of you who are not vegetarian yet, you've now heard all this from me, now knowingly you know what is happening, what you're doing when you're eating this meat, there's bad karma as a result of this. As a result, in the hereafter, one will have to suffer that bad karma from indeed being a part of an industry, even if only as the consumer. See, industries wouldn't exist if there were not consumers of that industry. But even as a consumer, if you are taking part in that industry, well, there will be bad karma. Because again, the untold suffering of these animals is amazing. It is hard to even think of how much suffering there is in the slaughterhouse industry. Because vegetarianism is, let's say, the dietary aspect of what really should be a lifestyle of ahimsa, of nonviolence, and of karuna, or compassion toward others. So indeed, and in a second we'll see how it goes beyond just the eating of animals. This includes being cruel to animals in any way whatsoever. An individual who is a spiritual person necessarily loves all beings. And what does this mean? Well, not just human beings. Indeed, to read this again, a well-wisher of all creatures. That person is a well-wisher of all creatures. So this means of all humans, this means of the gods, this means of animals, insects, birds, etc., etc. An individual who is truly expressing compassion is a person who does not want to harm animals in any way. And again, by extension, anyone, humans as well. But we're talking about animals for right now. This means that if you see an animal who is suffering, not just because they're about to be eaten, but, oh, they're being abused in some way, or they're ill, or something like this. A truly compassionate person, a truly spiritual person, will go out of their way to alleviate the suffering of that creature. And again, it doesn't matter what it is. It doesn't matter if it's a small insect that you see suffering. It doesn't matter if it's a larger animal, a human, etc., etc. Think of the logical sequence that is there. Oh, I claim to be a spiritual person. I don't care about the suffering of beings supposedly lesser than me, but yet I'm going to be happy. No, there's a logical disconnect that is there. The way that we have happiness is that in every sector of our life, in every field of our life, in every area of concern in our life, we strive for excellence. We strive to do the right thing. That being the case, when one lives a lifestyle that is called sattvic, that is a lifestyle of the good, then necessarily we have happiness, we have joy, we have what we're seeking. And when we don't have that joy, that happiness in our life, then we have to examine our life. Doesn't mean we're necessarily a bad person. It means that, oh, there's a disconnect. Somewhere there is a disconnect. So this is why we are to examine our life and to endeavor to live a life of authenticity, of goodness, of true spiritual life in every single sector of what we are and what we do. So if an individual wishes to be a truly spiritual person on the Vedic path, they are to avoid killing all creatures, any creatures whatsoever. No, if a person wants to be a serious spiritual practitioner, then at that point, that individual needs to be vegetarian, period.
Does anyone really believe that any human who enjoys eating the flesh of innocent creatures who have been tortured and murdered is enlightened and aligned with the highest good, ultimate truth, and supreme being? One of the most important Taoist manuals for students of the Integral Way is the Tai Shang Kan Yin Pian, in which the author wrote, quote, "Keep your diet primarily vegetarian. Buy captive creatures and set them free. Imagine yourself the captive. Abstain from taking life by your own hand or with your command. It is not a privilege for mankind to slaughter the lives of others. Whenever taking a step, watch for ants and insects, lest you hurt one of them. If the privileged in life are determined by size, then camels should ride on humans." End of quote. Unfortunately, although I began adhering to the non-harming and non-aggression principles more than 40 years ago, I have fallen off the way, and like all self-centered people, I have justified doing harm to other sentient beings as necessary for my own profit. At this stage in my life, however, I understand more clearly that this life is but a dream, as I said, gone in a flash, to be followed by eternity. When I leave this life, my fate will be determined by how I have treated others, not by my material wealth or physical health. All ancient sages have taught that moral self-discipline is essential for freedom and enlightenment, and without integrity, one has no chance of knowing ultimate truth and the Supreme Being. Therefore, I now value integrity more than ever in my life. Consequently, I need to practice a higher order of responsibility and virtue in order to achieve my destiny and spiritual development. For all my adult life, I have valued and preached non-aggression and the golden rule. Do not do to others what you do not want done to yourself. In October of 2022, we visited the small local farm from which we had been buying dairy products. Immediately upon entering the farm, I observed a stark contrast that made my heart sink. On my right, I saw a large pond and many water birds, primarily geese and ducks, enjoying freedom, while on my left I saw sheep and goats held captive in a large cage. As we progressed around the farm, we saw more sentient beings behind bars: donkeys, rabbits, pheasants, chickens, pigs, and of course cattle. The fences and cages testified that the animals were held captive against their own wills to roam freely. We found the calves kept in small cubicles, which on the spot reminded me of office cubicles, and even more, the cubicles that the authorities used to keep children separated during the so-called pandemic of 2020. Dairy farmers separate the unwilling calves and their unwilling mothers and cage them in an entirely different barn. I thought about people who are outraged about children being separated from their mothers at the US border. Yet gladly they're paying farmers to separate calves from their mothers so that they can eat milk, cheese, and ice cream. When I witnessed the calves reach out to one another from within their cages, hungry for contact with someone of their own kind, I confronted the uncomfortable and inconvenient truth. By drinking cow's milk or eating any animal flesh, I was a party to holding animals captive against their own will, forcibly impregnating the females, kidnapping offspring, stealing milk, and ultimately murdering the whole lot of them. Aggression is defined as a forceful action or procedure, such as an unprovoked attack, especially when intended to dominate or master. By this definition, the actions we take against animals to obtain animal products for food are undeniable aggression. I don't want anyone to treat me as a slave, and certainly do not want anyone to use me as livestock to be sacrificed for food. That being the case, if I continued to eat animals, I would be engaged in hypocrisy, doing unto others what I do not want done to myself, preaching non-aggression and doing just the opposite. Therefore, to live in accord with my own values, I must abstain from directly or indirectly holding any innocent sentient being as a slave or livestock to be used for food. For decades, I have known that there is a natural moral law, the law of karma, which can simply be stated as follows: as ye sow, so shall ye reap. Since 2020, it has become increasingly obvious that some so-called elites treat the common people as inferior beings who have no inviolable rights to life, liberty, or property. That is, they treat the common people as livestock who are destined to be managed, mandated, muffled, mutilated, medicated, milked, or murdered to fulfill the orders of their alleged superiors and to enrich the elites. Some of these elites even aspire to take full control of their human livestock with technology aimed at giving them the ability, the elites, the ability to hack your brain and thereby, in their minds, fully possess and truly own you. Humans treat non-human animals as inferior beings who have no rights to life, liberty, or property. In other words, they're treated as slaves. We pretend to own them, just as slave owners pretend to own other humans, just as the elites pretend to own all the common people. In 2021, after visiting that local small dairy farm, I realized that the natural law, as ye sow, so shall ye reap, explains why we the people are subject to abuse by the elites. We are simply reaping what we have sown. As long as we keep sowing slavery, we keep reaping it as well. As I explained in my ebook, Give Liberty or Get Slavery, quote, both Arcus, also known as Status, and Carnus believe that the rule of superior beings over inferior beings is legitimate, i.e. lawful, because it is allegedly natural. In a word, both believe in an alleged natural hierarchy in which, in principle, anyone deemed superior has by nature a lawful claim to possession of the life, liberty, and property of anyone deemed inferior, which puts the life, liberty, and property of the inferior at the absolute disposal of the superior. In either case, the self-proclaimed superior beings treat the allegedly inferior beings as livestock to be managed, mandated, muffled, mutilated, medicated, milked, or murdered to fulfill the orders of their alleged superiors. If I myself live by this code of conduct, by taking life, liberty, and property from so-called inferior animals, do I have any grounds on which to object to being enslaved or devoured, literally or figuratively, by anyone who declares himself to be superior to me, or anyone who succeeds in deceiving, coercing, or physically restraining me? When I asked myself this question, the answer came clear. No. If I do X to others myself, then I turn around and object to others doing action X to me, then I maintain a double standard. Rules for thee, not for me. And do as I say, not as I do. All moral agents naturally object to being subjected to double standards, which are the moral equivalent of self-contradiction. Indeed, whenever I claim that I am entitled or have a license to do whatever I do to others, I thereby permit others to do the same to me, or at least to others like me. It's like self-defense. If I attack someone, then I am licensing them to attack me. To wit, if I live by unjustly taking life, liberty, and property from others, whom I deem to be inferior, by my actions, I license others to deem me to be inferior and unjustly take my life, liberty, and property. In short, if I live by the code of carnism, then I automatically consent to so-called superior humans imposing slavery on so-called inferior humans. Indeed, since by natural law we always reap what we sow, if we live by the code of carnism, we will always, without fail, bring slavery upon ourselves. By definition, I can only legitimately call myself a libertarian if I faithfully live by the principle of non-aggression, non-violence, in thought, word, and deed. If I say that everyone should live by this principle, but in practice I don't, then by definition I am a hypocrite, a virtue-signaling fake libertarian. By definition, I can only legitimately call myself an anarchist if I faithfully live by the principle that no one is entitled to rule over or overrule or enslave others who have their own wills, lives, liberty, and properties. If I say that everyone should live by this principle, but in practice I don't live by that principle myself, and instead I rule over other people or beings, then by definition, I am a hypocrite, a virtue-signaling fake anarchist. By definition, I can only legitimately call myself a voluntarist if I faithfully live by the principle that all relationships should be voluntary and no one is entitled to initiate force to control the lives, liberty, and property of others. If I say that everyone should live by this principle, but in practice I don't, then by definition I am a hypocrite, a virtue-signaling fake voluntarist. Hence, I realize that if I were to continue to claim to be entitled by my self-proclaimed superiority to plunder and kill animals against their wills and interests and for my pleasure or profit, then I could not continue to claim to be a principled and practicing libertarian, anarchist, or voluntarist, nor could I object to self-proclaimed elites, authorities, and archons treating me and the common people as livestock. Previous to these realizations, I had erroneously thought that I could consider myself a freedom lover even while eating animals. More disturbing, upon reflection, I, like many others, actually thought that by eating animals I was demonstrating my liberty. In reality, I was demonstrating my immorality. When eating innocent animals, I was not demonstrating freedom, but destroying it. Once I realized that carnism is in principle incompatible with libertarianism, anarchism, or voluntarism, it became clear that I faced a dilemma. Either stop being a party to taking life, liberty, and property from innocent animals, or stop claiming that I stand for morality and liberty and against tyranny and slavery. In other words, I had to choose from two mutually exclusive alternatives. Either stop eating animals or be an advocate of tyranny and slavery and stop claiming to be a voluntarist, anarchist, and libertarian. As mentioned, I've discussed all this in much greater philosophical detail in my ebook. There is no way that I can stop valuing freedom. There's no way I'm going to give up my spiritual path at this point in my life. Therefore, I have no choice but to stop eating animal products. Thanks for watching.